Have you ever read the novel Les Miserables by Victor Hugo? It tells the story of a man named Jean Valjean who is recently paroled from prison after serving 19 years. Why was he in prison for 19 years? Because he stole a loaf of bread. Now, that seems pretty severe. 19 years for stealing a loaf of bread? That's outrageous. Except he didn't just steal a loaf of bread. That was just the very small crime that started the dominoes falling. And what happened was he was in prison and he's had a 5-year sentence. And then he tried to escape prison. And each time he would escape and get recaught, they'd add 3 more years. And he'd resist arrest and they'd tack on more time. Eventually, what started with a very small crime ended up with 19 years of imprisonment, which seems so unjust. But if you count up each of his offenses, technically he did serve the just amount of time. French justice, the law of the land at the time, was met in his sentencing, but it's still not fair. Well, Jean Valjean is now the holder of a yellow passport that identifies him as a convict, which means it's very difficult for him to find a place to stay or find work or anything like that. And he's desperate. And finally, a kindly priest takes him in, gives him food, gives him shelter. And Jean Valjean looks around the priest's quarters at the monastery or church or whatever, and he sees all this silverware and silver plates and all these nice things, and so he can't help himself. He loads it all up in the middle of the night and he steals all this expensive treasure. And so he takes that stuff and runs away and gets caught by the police. And the police bring him back to the priest, the Catholic priest. And the Catholic priest, instead of pressing charges, instead of being shocked and horrified by what Jean Valjean has done to betray his trust, instead the priest grabs a couple silver candlesticks and says, "Shame on you, Jean Valjean. I gave you all of this to change your life. I gave you all of this to buy your soul. You're now a changed man, and you forgot to take these candlesticks with you." And so the police are like, "Well, surely he's just a thief, right?" And the priest says, No, I gave this all to him. By making up that story, the priest saves Jean Valjean from going back to prison probably for the rest of his life, and also changes Jean Valjean. This act of mercy transforms him. It happens gradually in the novel, but he eventually becomes a completely different person because of the kindness of this priest. And so this priest spends this treasure. He lets Jean Valjean leave with the plates and the silverware and the candlesticks. And that gift then purchases Jean Valjean's freedom. It justifies him. And so, in contrast to the original prison sentence for stealing a loaf of bread, the priest now has set Jean Valjean free by paying a high price. But it still came at a price. And the original act of stealing that stuff in the middle of the night in the first place kind of just gets swept under the rug. And so even though it's this great turning point in the novel and sets the tone for the rest of the book, it still misses something. It's difficult to stand for justice and the letter of the law and punishment, and yet also be merciful at the same time. But this is exactly what God accomplishes through Jesus Christ. In our Sunday school class, we've been studying Romans, and we've gone through most of Romans chapter 3, and we finally got to just the heart of that chapter, where it says that now this new righteousness has been made known that comes through faith in Jesus Christ. And so this not guiltiness that we're all very concerned about, because we're all guilty in the eyes of God. We've sinned. We've been selfish. We've made ourselves God. We have done many things to separate ourselves from the Lord. And yet there's a not guiltiness, almost an acquittal, but not exactly, a freedom that can be given through faith in Jesus Christ. And it says in Romans chapter 3 down in verse 25, it says that God presented him as a sacrifice of atonement through faith in his blood, and he did this to demonstrate his justice. And then you go further down into verse 26, it says he did it to demonstrate his justice at the present time, so as to be just and the one who justifies those who have faith in Jesus. Do you see what God is doing through the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross? He is paying the proper price. The right amount of sentencing is happening. We have turned away from God. We have rejected him in our sinfulness, and that deserves death. And so Jesus dies and pays that penalty. But because Jesus himself wasn't guilty and instead takes our place, those of us who are guilty, our sins are paid for by that substitute, then we get justified. We get set free. Our freedom is purchased at this great price of the life of Jesus Christ when he dies on the cross. And so God is able to be perfectly just. He doesn't sweep anything under the rug. He doesn't just forget about the candlesticks and the silver plates and pretend like that was never in the inventory of the monastery. No, he pays the correct price. Everything is settled. Our sins are fully paid for by Jesus. But because they're paid for by Jesus and not us, we're justified. We are forgiven. We're set free. And so God is able to be both just and the justifier through the atoning work of Jesus Christ on the cross.